Hey guys, welcome back to the VERS, where we are learning about all things Web 3.0 related. Today we're going to try and cover the topic of blockchains. Now blockchains are quite complex, but I'm going to do my best to give you a super simple explanation of blockchains. I personally think this is one of the most exciting technologies that we could have discovered, and that it's something that has the potential to really make meaningful, positive impact on the world in future. I'm going to cover 4 things in today's video. Firstly, I want to give you a sense of what I think the problem that blockchains are helping us to solve really is. Secondly, I want to try and give you that super simple explanation about how a blockchain actually functions. Thirdly, I want to give you a sense of 5 defining properties or characteristics of a blockchain. And lastly, I want to give you a simple example of a type of a problem that a blockchain is helping us to actually solve practically in the world today. Before we get there, here's today's trivia. When was the first time that the idea of a blockchain was conceived? If you said 1991, you were 100% correct, but it wasn't actually until 2008 when the first meaningful implementation of blockchains actually happened, but we'll talk more about that one in a future video. Now let's have a go at defining the problem. The first thing you need to understand is the concept of a ledger. Now all a ledger is a record of transactions. And as humans, we've been using ledgers for centuries. An example of a ledger that you might be using at home on a day-to-day basis would be a ledger to keep track of your daily expenses. You would record what you bought, how much you paid for it, and when you bought it. Let's take a slightly more complex example. Let's talk about a bank. A bank keeps a record of our financial transactions. They keep our bank balances, they keep track of money that comes into our accounts, and they keep track of money that leaves our accounts. And banks keep track of these transactions for all of their clients in a single ledger that is stored centrally at the bank. Now, what's the problem with this, you may ask? Let me give you a couple of examples. The first is, let's say you were living in London, you had a good life, you were doing well for yourself, you wanted to send some money back to your family in Cape Town. That money would have to leave your bank account in London, most likely move through a couple of intermediaries along the way before it arrived at a bank account in Cape Town. Each of the banks, as well as the intermediaries, would charge fees, which means that the system is costly and inefficient. Secondly, let's make it a little bit more sinister. Banks have ledgers of transactions that are stored centrally in the bank. There's a single point of access to that ledger, which means they are susceptible or vulnerable to hackers. Hackers could attack and access the ledger and change the information in the ledger. They could change your bank balances, they could take all of your money because the record of your money and how much you have is actually stored in the ledger at the bank. So banks are vulnerable to these types of attacks from hackers or any other sinister parties. Thirdly, what if the bank decided to help themselves to your money? Now I know what you're thinking. We trust banks. They're trusted parties. They would never do this. Sadly, in 2013, it actually happened. 2 of the largest banks in Cyprus decided to help themselves to the deposits of their customers overnight and give them equity or shares in the bank in exchange. This is commonly referred to as a bank bail-in, and the 2 banks had no choice because they were kind of forced to do it by European regulators. And while bank bail-ins are not all that common, they do happen, and it is possible that your bank may actually decide one day, for whatever reason, to help itself to your money. So centralized ledgers that are stored in a single place, like those that are used and found in banks, are inefficient, they are vulnerable to attack, and are becoming less trusted. But what if we didn't need centralized ledgers or trusted parties like banks for you and I to be able to transact with each other? What if we could transact directly with each other and have the peace of mind that the ledger or the technology that was facilitating our transactions between each other was totally secure and stored in multiple different places? Enter blockchains. So what are blockchains? If there's one thing you remember from this video, I hope you remember that blockchains are nothing more than ledgers. They are distributed ledgers, so they aren't stored in a single place. Instead, copies of the ledger, the record of transactions, are stored in multiple places, in millions of computers or nodes that are distributed around the world in what is known as a peer-to-peer network. And every participant in the peer-to-peer network is responsible for making sure that new transactions that are added to the blockchain are actually correct. So each of the copies or each of the participants holding a copy of the blockchain has to agree that any new transactions that are added to the blockchain are indeed correct. So it's stored in a totally decentralized way. Now let's take a look at maybe a little bit more of the practical workings of this. Let's try and imagine it. We're going to use financial transactions again. So imagine that transactions are taking place between people all around the world. People are sending money to each other, receiving money from each other, making payments, making transfers, any of those sorts of things. Every few minutes or every few seconds, the transactions that have taken place in the last few minutes or seconds are grouped together in a block. The participants in the network who are responsible for validating the block, in other words, ensuring that the transactions that have been updated are indeed correct, are called miners. Once a block is created, the miners get to work using their computers and cryptography to actually validate that the transactions that have been added to the block are indeed correct. Once the block has been validated, it is added to all of the other blocks that have been created and validated in the same way before it, and that hold the records of all the transactions that have taken place in the blockchain to date. And those blocks that are attached to each other form a chain of blocks, and hence the description blockchain. The miners who are doing the work with their computers and cryptography to validate that the information in the blocks is indeed correct are rewarded for their work with tokens. But we'll talk about tokens and how miners are rewarded in a future video in the series. Now let's take a look at the properties of blockchains. And I'm going to give you 5 properties that if you remember, you will know pretty much most of what you need to know at a simple level about blockchains. The first is that blockchains are distributed ledgers. They are not stored centrally, they are stored across a network, they are decentralized. The second is that they are a peer-to-peer network. Copies of the network are stored on many computers around the world, also known as nodes, and are connected to each other in a peer-to-peer network. The third is that a blockchain is transparent. Anybody can go and view all the transactions that have taken place on a blockchain at any time. But the blockchain is pseudonymous, which means you don't have to reveal your identity as the transacting party. So while you or me could go and view all of the transactions on the blockchain, we may not necessarily be able to identify the people who are transacting because they have the choice about whether to reveal their identity or not. The fourth and quite an important one is that blockchains are immutable or irreversible. This means that once a transaction has been written to the ledger in a blockchain, it is near impossible to actually go and reverse that transaction, which is a feature that contributes to the security of blockchains quite a lot. And the last is that blockchains can be programmable. Now let's move on to a simple problem. Did you know that 70% of the landowners in the world have no certainty over their claim to their land? In fact, in 2004, only 1% of the land in sub-Saharan Africa had formal government registration. Now, why is this a problem? If you have no certainty over the claim to your land, you can't use the land to secure financing, so you can't borrow against the land, and you can't substantially plan for your future on the land. It is one of the things that inhibits economic participation. So what if there was a way to create a more immutable record of land ownership? And a blockchain provides the perfect technology for this. If your claim to your land or your ownership of the land was stored in a blockchain, or the transaction that transferred a property into your name was stored in a blockchain, it would be immutable and irreversible, and your claim to that land would be forever recorded in the blockchain until that property was transferred to somebody else. So this solves quite a fundamental problem for many people in the world through the technology, It forever creates certainty around the claim to that land and enables broader economic participation. Now, companies are already talking to governments about this. It's a simple example, but I think you can see how it could make quite a meaningful difference in the lives of people who lack that certainty to the claim over their land. Before I sign off for today, let's cover today's VERS Vernacular. And today's term is smart contracts. Now, you might remember earlier when I covered the principles or the properties of a blockchain, I said that the fifth property was that blockchains are programmable. Now, not all blockchains are programmable, but for those that are, the computer programs that live in the blocks of a blockchain and that execute when certain conditions are met are referred to as smart contracts. We'll talk a lot more about smart contracts in future videos as we cover more complex topics along the way. For today, I hope that I've given you a simple explanation of blockchains and given you a little bit of a feel for applications of blockchains, given you a few things that you can use to remember what blockchains are. And I encourage you to start thinking about ledgers, where ledgers are used and where a blockchain ledger would be a more appropriate technology to use than the centralized versions of ledgers that we use today. Thanks very much for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Please tune in next week when we're going to talk about the one blockchain that rules them all. See you next week.